two, one. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our June Zoomers to Boomers Roundtable. Thank you so much to all of our incredible participants for being here. And also a big thank you to everybody watching back home on YouTube. It's super important that you're tuning in. Zoomers to Boomers is part of the Raven Corps's aim to create intergenerational roundtable discussion groups. And our focus is to represent multiple different perspectives from different age groups, different backgrounds. And that's why we're doing these monthly roundtables on various topics. And so our participants today are joining the second roundtable of 2022. There's still plenty more to come. So if you're watching this YouTube live stream right now and thinking that you may be interested in doing one of these, the link to apply is in the live stream chat under our link tree. So make sure to go take a look there and fill out an application if this looks like something that you'd be interested in taking part of. Our roundtables are a ton of fun and just such great experiences. And before we get into the roundtable, I just want to put a spotlight on something that the Raven Corps is focusing on right now, which is called Operation Mind Over Milk, or OpMom for short. And it's focused on the really unjust practice of dairy being forced onto students' plates at schools across America during lunch. This really supports the cruel practices of dairy farming and causes a lot of waste. 45 million gallons of milk were wasted in 2019 alone. And it gets worse when you realize that students must provide a doctor's note to access plant-based milks. So all of that together is why we're working against this practice. That's what our whole Operation Mind Over Milk is focused on. So if you're interested in helping that out, anyone aged 15 through 22 can join as Ravens to be part of the Raven community. And older folks can still support our youth advocacy. Again, you can find all this information, how to join the operation, how to join Zoomers to Boomers, all of that is in the link tree in the chat. So with all that being said, now is time to get into today's roundtable. As a brief introduction to the issue, the dairy industry really plays a major role in society and has a huge sway over policy and education alike. So in this discussion, we're going to be specifically focusing and taking a look at the impacts that this industry has on animals involved in the system. And this roundtable will be the first part of a larger 3-part series, which focuses on the overall impact of dairy. With that being said, it's time to get into introductions. So for the introductions, we're going to ask that you all share your name, pronouns, age, or generation if you don't feel comfortable saying your exact age, your location, your title / the organization that you're affiliated with, and your favorite plant-based milk, and I'll put all that in the chat. So I'll go first. My name is Casey. My pronouns are she, her. I'm 17 years old, so I'm part of Gen Z. I'm located in Los Angeles, California, and I'm currently a lead Raven with the Raven Corps. And my favorite plant-based milk is definitely almond milk for cereal, but coconut milk for drinks and ice cream. And then if whoever wants to go next can use the raised hand feature, that's how we'll be doing things for the rest of the day. I'll be calling on people based on the raised hand feature, so you guys can just go ahead and raise your hands and I'll call on people in the order that I see it. Okay, Cody, go ahead.
Hey, I'm Cody Carlson. I use he, him pronouns. I'm 38 years old, which makes me a millennial, I guess Gen Z cusp. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. Right now I'm affiliated with the law offices. Favorite milk, oat milk, lots of coffee.
Awesome. Sounds great.
Yeah.
Okay, Sage.
Hello, my name is Sage. I'm 20 years old and I live in Pocatello, Idaho. I'm technically an environmental activist, but I am one of the leaders in the Human Liberation Corps. And I guess my favorite plant-based milk would have to be oat milk. It's a lot healthier and a lot better for the environment.
Awesome. Oh, and then if anyone isn't sure where the raised hand feature is, if you click on more, it should be under reactions. It should just give an option to raise your hand. So if you go there, you'll be able to. Okay, next we have Mia.
Hey everybody, I'm super excited to be here and talk to all of you. My name is Mia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm 19. I'm also in Brooklyn, New York. Go Brooklyn. And I am kind of in a lot of places. I work for the Raven Corps on the Operation Mom. I'm also involved with FFAC and Friends of the Earth and a bunch of other organizations. I'm also gonna go with oat milk. I feel like I've been really enjoying the oat milk lately.
Solid choice. Okay, next is Amelie.
Okay, hello, I'm Amelie. I go by she. I'm also 17 and I'm in Chicago right now. And that's right. And my favorite plant-based milk is cashew milk. It just became cashew milk when I tried out making it.
Awesome. Next, we have Jean.
Hey everyone, my name is Gene. I'm he, his. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm the president and co-founder of Farm Sanctuary. And favorite plant-based milk, I'm going with oat, man. It seems like the popular one today, but I really love the oat milk.
Definitely a popular choice, but rightfully so. Next, we have Paula.
Hello, I'm Paula Moncrief. My pronouns are she, her. I'm 34, so I'm a millennial. I'm located in Sacramento, California. I work for Mercy for Animals in the investigations department. And my favorite milk is soy milk.
Nice. Next, we have David.
Hello, so I am David Rosengard. He or they pronouns are fine. I am Generation X. I'm in my 40s. I'm not going to do the exact math because math is hard. There's a reason I went to law school, not med school. I really enjoy oat milk, although there's this particular kind of like pea oat milk blend that I purchased once at like one of these grocery outlet stores where they're getting rid of all the stuff the regular grocery store can't sell. And I can't remember the brand, which is tragic because it was amazing. So if any of you have experienced a really good pea oat milk, you should let me know. I'm trying to find it once again. Oh, and I'm with the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I'm a managing attorney in the criminal justice program.
Great, nice to meet you. Next, we have AJ.
Hi, I'm AJ. I go by he, him. I'm 36 years old from San Bernardino, California. Currently, I'm not associated in particular with any organization. I used to organize with DXE, SAVE, and AB, but now I'm just a regular activist participating whenever I can. And my favorite milk in general, it is oat milk also, but soy milk for a few exceptional cases where oat milk just doesn't taste good, like Indian tea and custard and pudding that I make. It's just soy milk works better. But in general, oat milk is good. Yeah.
Definitely understandable. Next is Alexandra.
Well, AJ is not just a regular activist because I know him personally through DXE, and he's a superior activist and a wonderful person. My name is Alexandra Paul. I live in Los Angeles, California. I will be 59 in less than a month, and I go by she, her. And I really like pea milk, but it comes in the plastic, so I go for oat milk.
Happy early birthday.
Thank you.
Next.
I'm a baby boomer. The last year of baby boomers was 64, and I was born in 63, so I'm
right at the cutoff.
I'm a young baby boomer.
Nice. Okay, next is Ishan.
Hey y'all, my name's Ishan Sinha. I use he, him pronouns. I'm 17, so I guess that makes me a Zoomer. And I'm located in Hillsboro, Oregon, and right now I'm affiliated with Raven Corps. And I don't have a favorite plant-based milk just yet, but I definitely got to try some more to get a preference.
Definitely valid opinion. And then
greetings to a fellow Oregonian.
Is there anyone who hasn't gone at this point? Okay, Sophia.
Hey guys, my name's Sophia. Sorry, just finding the questions. So I'm Sophia. My pronouns are she and her. I'm 21 from Gen Z. I live in Adelaide, Australia, and I used to be quite involved with the Raven Corps, except I've been a little bit off the radar for the past year or so, but hoping to get involved again. And my favorite milk would be oat milk, for sure.
Right. And I think we got everyone. So thank you all so much for the introductions. And to everybody who's not here but is currently watching the live stream, make sure to introduce yourself in the chat. We definitely want to get to know you there as well. Okay. And before we get into the guiding questions, I just wanted to say that again, for the guiding questions, we'll be doing it the same way as the introductions, where I'll be calling on people based on the raise hand feature. A few general guidelines: make sure to keep your cameras on, just to make sure that people know how you're expressing yourself while they're talking, and also be respectful of everyone's opinions. Make sure that you're participating, but don't hog the discussion. We definitely want to hear everyone's viewpoints, so just make sure that you're giving everyone a chance to share. So with that, we'll jump right in. The very first question that we have on the topic is, what is your perspective on how the dairy industry impacts animals? And with this comes a secondary question related to it about your personal experiences related to the topic. So here we go. Please feel free to share anything personal, anything you've read, anything that you have knowledge on related to this question. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, I have had a lot of experience, unfortunately, going to dairies, documenting conditions. We have sanctuaries in New York and California, which are big dairy states, so have witnessed lots of cruelty. One of the areas where we put a lot of attention had to do with downed animals, animals too sick to walk. And because the dairy industry pushes the cows so hard, they are a primary reason that downed animals are being sent to slaughter. So spent a lot of time dealing with that. Also, I got a master's degree at Cornell, looking at small dairies and how they were trying to survive through rotational grazing as opposed to the industrial dairy model. And it was an interesting way to kind of learn about how, even though certain farmers are still exploiting animals, they actually had less of a, they actually paid more attention to animals grazing. And so there's a difference between an industrial farm and a small farm. I'm still against all animal exploitation, and that's, I guess, the bottom line with dairy and what I would call cow's milk instead of just milk. I think they own that term and shouldn't, but it's an industry that is very entrenched in Washington, and it's problematic, and we don't need cow's milk ultimately is the bottom line. But within the dairy industry, there are some variations too, but at the end of the day, we don't need cow's milk.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that experience. Alexandra, go ahead.
I have quite a bit of experience investigating on dairy farms in California and Wisconsin. And one thing that I feel like people overlook is that the dairy calves are kept in these small hutches, and veal calves get a lot of attention, but the dairy calves, especially in California where the hutches are wooden and not igloo shaped with a little run, they're basically in an enclosure that is the same size as the ones for dairy calf, pretty much. I mean, it's 56 inches by 32 inches, those wooden crates. So the next step for California has done a lot to protect veal calves. We now give them, what is it, I think, AJ, Jean, 42 square feet or something of 24 square feet. It's a lot we're giving them. Is that right, Jean?
Enough room to turn around. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's enough room to turn around basically. So pretty small.
The veal calves, though,
yeah.
At Proposition 12, I thought was giving them a ton of space. But anyway, the crates, the crates that dairy calves are put in are just horrendous also, and especially because they're taken away just within hours of being born.
Definitely, definitely. AJ, go ahead. AJ, I believe you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. What was I saying about the calf hutches? I just wanted to make a point about that. I used to do bi-weekly vigils with Chino Cow Save here in San Bernardino, California. And Chino, in the 1970s and 1980s, it used to be the largest dairy producing region, at least in America, if not the world. And so there's quite a few dairy farms there. But one thing about the calf hutches is that for full-blown dairy operations, what I've noticed all the time is that although the cows themselves are close to the street in full public view, where the public gets the impression that they're free and happy and everything, the hutches are always like in the back. You can hardly see them, hidden away. And then there are a couple of operations that are exclusively calf hutches, no dairy, and those, there's like fences and tarps covering them, blocking them completely. So they make a really strong effort to hide that from the public view for a very good reason, because no one wants to see those babies away from the mothers, confined into such a small space. Just wanted to point that out. Yeah.
Totally. Cody, go ahead.
Hey, I'll just briefly answer both these questions in reverse order. My personal experience related to the dairy industry's impact on animals comes from, well, I guess similar to Jean and Alexandra's. I started snooping around and did an undercover employment-based investigation in 2010 of the biggest dairy farm in the Northeast, the US. I later did some legal work in this area. It was mainly in the realm of antitrust and had to do with the way that the dairy industry was effectively forcing small farmers out of the business and killing off small herds in order to reduce supply and increase the price of milk. But my perspective on how the industry impacts animals, I was very much struck, like Jean was, with the prevalence of downed animals and the industry's tendency, particularly in big facilities like the one I was at, to just overdrive animals, keep breeding them, keep milking them until they can no longer support themselves, in the way that those animals would then be really severely neglected for weeks once that happened. The other thing that was really striking for me was the emotional suffering that came with upsetting the mother and calf bond and separating animals at such a young age. I'd go on to work at some other animal industries where there was a lot more, I think, overt like suffering and pain. So, there are ways in which this industry operates very differently than a lot of other factory farms, but that emotional suffering, that familial disruption really stood out as a really the main form of cruelty that's inherent in this industry, small and big farms alike.
Completely. Thanks for bringing that up. David, go ahead.
So I similarly will answer this in reverse order. So in terms of personal experiences, my legal practice is largely as a victim rights attorney for animals. And so I've worked a number of criminal cruelty cases that arise out of dairy situations, whether that is the mother cows, whether it is baby calves. And this runs the gamut of industrial factory farming dairies, smaller privately dairies not owned by corporations, smaller dairies that are family operations. Criminal cruelty can be found in both of those sorts of scenarios. And there are often not a lot of recourse available for the cows, because as those of you who've spoken about your experiences investigating can attest to, it's very difficult for the public to find out what's happening, which means it's unlikely that there's going to be intervention. And even when there is, that can be a slow, difficult process, which we can talk about if people like. In terms of my perspective on how the dairy industry impacts animals, I would say off the top, it's almost inherently exploitive. The biological mechanics are that a mother animal is being put in a position of becoming pregnant, getting birth, and not being able to devote all of her milk to her child. Those animals aren't getting anything out of that relationship. There is no retirement plan for dairy cows. There is no attempt to compensate them for this. Beyond that, it almost certainly in practice involves maltreatment. There are small dairies where people are out there every day keeping an eye on the physical health of their cows, but in practice, from what I've seen, a lot of times animals get sick, animals get injured, they don't get care, and there's the emotional toll that we've discussed. And often it involves criminal cruelty. Not all maltreatment is criminal. We can talk about why that is, but in practice, there's a lot of acts of commission, so abuse where people are actively hurting cows, And there's even more acts of omission where cows are just being neglected to a point of criminality.
Very valid points. Alexandra.
This just reminds me that it's ironic that most of us, at least older, who've been either vegetarian or vegan older, we started off giving up meat. But actually dairy is so cruel. And the doctors will tell you too, because I have a podcast where we interview folks and I interview a lot of doctors, they'll tell you for your health, give up dairy first. That is better, more important for your health than meat. And ethically, we're seeing such cruelty because, as David says, they end up dead anyway. But they have a life of cruelty. I would prefer to be a beef cow, I think. Jean, tell me if I'm wrong, than be a dairy cow. Yet most of us are vegetarian first, and then we give up the dairy.
Yeah,
Definitely.
dairy cows have it worse.
Yep, and people still think intuitively that meat is worse, but yeah, very valid point. Paula, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, the idea that people say it's so hard to give up cheese and they just give up everything first and then at the end cheese cheese, basically dairy. I'm going to answer the question also first, the second one. So my personal experiences, I received the footage that undercover investigators get in these facilities. So I have to go through a lot of footage. And what struck me the most is that what you see like in a public video, basically like a video that goes to YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, is just a glimpse of what it is. But seeing like hours of just like footage that doesn't even make the spotlight, and just see the life of them, how horrible and how banal it is. Like there's nothing for them to do. I mean, besides just calling for their babies, they don't get to like enjoy their life. They don't get to play. They don't get to like have their friends around. It's just, they just are moved from one place. These cows, they're moved from one place to another. They're always like going to the milk parlor, going back, going to the showers. They're just always on the move. They don't get to just be them. And I think that's for me everything is horrible and terrible, but seeing that monotony of their lives. And it's just like one day after another, plus the forced inseminations and getting their babies taken away from them and being neglected to a point that workers or like the owners of these places, they don't care if the cow has an eye falling or like whatever is happening. As long as they give milk, it's okay. As long as they are producing milk, nothing else matters until they're down cows. So yeah, I wanted to share that.
For sure. It's heartbreaking. Amelie, go ahead.
I think that, and I say this because this is what's happened to me. I feel like when looking at different like cases and hearing all these stories, these horror stories of what happens to cows on dairy farms, on the standard dairy farm, most of what happens in a cow's life is so horrible that even the smaller things, like them being bored all the time, them not having anything to do, even that can, like, it's just so horrible. But because everything is bad, it can be easy to say like, oh well, these cows at least they like have a good life before they're killed. So I think it's easy to lose perspective when looking at all this horrendous treatment.
Definitely. Sean.
Yeah, I guess I want to just add on, like, I noticed that, like, I guess there's a lot of, I would agree that comparatively, that dairy farming is that the dairy industry is the meat industry, in the sense that all the cows that are in the dairy industry are killed for meat in one way or another, or maybe not all, but most. And then to that end, it's also, we were talking about exploitation, and the cruelty comparatively is arguably even more in dairy farms. And that makes me think of the point of, like, as people try to phase out and become more plant-based, like at least in my personal life, I'm someone who's vegetarian right now, but is trying to phase out milk and eggs, and it makes me think, man, maybe the best approach would have been to first phase out milk, and then step towards meat. But I think that comparatively across the board, there's an intense amount of exploitation and cruelty that's going in the dairy and animal industries, and I think that I think it's important to work towards phasing it out in your personal life.
100%. Go ahead, Alexandra.
I just want to say thank you for giving up what you've given up, and it's a process. As someone who was vegetarian for 33 years, my biggest regret that I didn't give up dairy earlier. But so I have a lot of empathy for people's journey, and I made up a ton of excuses. And I wasn't even addicted to cheese, which is most people's thing. Yeah, we can only a lot of it's because we don't know about the dairy industry, and we have a million ways of justifying why it's okay to still drink dairy. But you're well on your way, Isham, so thank you.
For sure, yes. Sage, go ahead.
So sort of on a similar note from what everybody's been talking about, I think it's very unethical to basically use up these cows' lives and then just slaughter them. So I don't have personal experience. I've never worked on a farm. I've never really been around cows. But I do work, my major is in environmental science, and we focus a lot on conservation, ethical treatment of animals, so on and so forth. And as soon as cows stop producing milk, then they don't go to a farm. They're automatically slaughtered. So I just think that's really unethical and very unfair to them.
Completely. Does anyone else have any thoughts that they'd like to share on this question?
I have a question. I don't know of what if people think. I find it so interesting, and tell me if I'm just going way too out there, that female dairy calves are treated worse than male veal calves or bulls, and that female dairy cows who give milk and who are pregnant 10 months of every year are also just treated so badly. Is there a sexist thing, or is it not? Do we think that, or is it? Am I just being crazy? Is it the fact that they think we don't kill them that makes dairy acceptable, or are we just allowing female animals? I don't know. It's crossed my mind.
That's definitely an interesting thought on the issue. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree actually, because cows, male cows, I think they're slaughtered within 2 to 3 years. Dairy cows produce milk up to 6 years, and then as soon as they stop producing, that's when their life ends. But to forcefully inseminate them over and over and over again, and then just take their calves, I feel like that's worse torture than, them just living out their lives, eating until they're slaughtered. So I definitely agree with that statement.
Definitely. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I also agree. I think you're absolutely onto something with a degree of sexism involved. And I think part of it has to do with another through line that I've heard a lot of people bring up, which is the way dairy is presented to the public, the way we think about it in pop culture, is as a kinder, a nicer option than meat, because the message is these animals are just giving milk, they don't die. I think part of where the sexism comes in is that whole messaging depends on no one stopping and asking, what does it take for an animal to give milk? That animal had to get pregnant and give birth, and then someone took their baby away. That's how the biology works. And I mean, I like a number of you, I started out vegan or vegetarian and transitioned to veganism. And I remember the moment I had that realization, I was like, I will not repeat what I said because it was not fit for polite company, but I was like, how did I not see that? But I think it is related to sexism and related to our difficulty to just look at the lives of animals who are also, in their own context, women, female animals in that context.
Completely. And I had that same realization when I went from vegetarian to vegan. Amelie, go ahead.
I think that the image most people have of a cow is of a female cow. And like the word for a male cow is like, it's so different, it's bull. But a cow is thought of as a female cow with udders, even with a calf. And in the imagery and advertising, I think that's what we see, even for meat. So a lot of the time. So I just think it's interesting that the imagery has become of a female cow representing all cows. And I think it's because we see a lot of people see, and including like before I was vegan, I saw cows this way. I saw it as like their bodies were meant to do something, like they're related to dairy because their bodies are for that purpose. And it's seen as the female body's purpose to provide for others rather than just existing for that individual.
Great points, Amelie. AJ, go ahead.
I wanted to make two different points. I think the sexist nature, I think it applies to all of animal agriculture, but that's only because I think, because I mean, males are reproductively exploited as well. I mean, they have to get the semen from somewhere, right? But I think it's the numbers also. It's when you think about the numbers, whether it's egg-laying hens or dairy-producing cows, it's compared to the males in numbers, they are more exploited. So they're the first ones that come to mind. That was the first point. The second point, all this talk about dairy appearing like nice and not harmful and stuff, it just reminded me of the paradox in Hindu culture, which is from where I come from. I'm a born and raised vegetarian, at least until 7 years ago myself, and a lot of people wonder like why if cows are so revered and they're thought of as like mothers, how does that work with the dairy industry in India? And number one, it's and also like besides the dairy industry, you also have to remember that India has been like in the top three, top 3 to 5 beef and leather exporting countries in the world. So how does that make sense? Number one, when as far as like the reverence of cows goes, it's only for female cows and it's only for that species. It's not like for buffaloes or anything like that. The majority of the beef coming out of India is buffaloes. And second, when you, in fact, I think it's actually illegal to export cow meat from outside of India. Not that it just still doesn't happen, and then another point is when you look at the roots, the ancient reasons of why this reverence came to be in the first place, different scholars will say, point to different mythological parts of Indian texts, but like there's one thing in common. And funny enough, this reverence is tied exactly to the fact that cows give milk. I put in quotation marks. So coinciding with vegetarianism, it's like it's not that Indians did eat cows. At least the bovine species before at some point. But especially with the introduction of vegetarianism from Buddhist influence and whatnot, like the cow just became this like, I guess, figure of selfless giving. I read something to the effect of like, this docile animal takes very little, eats grass, but gives so much in the form of milk and dung and stuff. And so that's funny enough, that's where this reverence comes from. I just think it's so crazy. And it's like, maybe just like, in the rest of the world in the early days, they probably were treated like very much like family members, despite this exploitation, a couple of cows kept in the house, treated really well, but it's nothing like the reality today. This reverence is just superficial and it's when you have a business, if you don't need the cow anymore, what are you going to do? Like you're either going to sell it to someone who will kill them, even if you don't kill them with your own hands as a Hindu person, or a lot of times they like just let them loose on the streets, or they'll, to feel less guilty, they'll take them to a temple and tie them to a tree, stuff like that. So that's how that paradox is explained. Just thought. Yeah.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much for telling us about that. Wow. David, go ahead.
So something you were just saying, AJ, in terms of sort of historical pre-modern cow use, cow-human relationships, makes me think about this question of exploitation and its inherency. And I'm willing to grant that there's probably a version of living with cows that minimizes exploitation and maybe isn't exploitive. If one exists in a world where that cow's babies are getting milk and the human is taking some milk that is not necessary to that baby calf's well-being, if there is any such milk left over, and the cow is living in a good life with the humans, being protected from predators, etc., we could talk about that as like a mutualist relationship, not an exploitive relationship. But there are so vanishingly few places that happens anymore in humanity. And I think that part of the truly clever project of modern industrial agriculture is being really invested in getting people to think that agriculture is still this pre-modern people and animals living in harmony on a farm, not a, even at its smallest scale, modern agriculture isn't that. It's animals being used and not getting anything out of it.
Definitely. Amelie, go ahead.
I think it's a slippery slope, right? A lot of people say that vegans and even vegetarians are too, like, they live in this fantasy world, or it's like everything they think is in theory and the reality isn't as bad. And I think that vegans can seem to get a little theoretical, like, oh, well, using someone's body, even if it doesn't hurt them, is exploitation. And some people could say, oh, well, that's too theoretical. In reality, if that happened, it wouldn't hurt the animal, like, it's fine. But that likely did happen in the past, where it wasn't so exploitive. It was just maybe even seen as companionship. But because we did use someone else's body, it was a slippery slope, and now it's evolved into what it is today.
Completely great points. And that actually brings me really close to the topic of our next question, which is essentially taking everything that was mentioned in the prior question, everything you all said, and just asking, is it ethical for people to consume dairy? And does this ethicality differ based on the size of the farm? And also, are there certain cases in which your answer changes? Because we know that there's not a one-size-fits-all model or solution for anything. So if anybody has an answer to this question, feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think we've naturally, transitioned into that question already, a lot of it. But I was reading an article from an Israeli news source just a couple of days ago, the Jerusalem Post, and they were talking about how technology is giving us a way to produce dairy identical stuff without cows involved. And one phrase they mentioned in particular was artificial fermentation. And, like, my mind goes ding, ding, yeah, like, yes, artificial fermentation, not artificial insemination. And so, and there's a company doing that, Perfect Day. A lot of you might have heard of a company already there. They've already successfully used precision fermentation, artificial fermentation to produce whey without any part of any animal involved in the entire process. And the thing that sets this apart from something like cultured production, where you actually do need cells from an animal, is they don't need anything. They don't need a DNA. And when I got curious, how is that even possible? And I went to their website where they discussed the process in a lot of detail. And the key part was that they're saying they don't need the DNA because scientists have already mapped the entire bovine genome and they can just get the information they need from there, which I thought is pretty fantastic. And they're also working on getting casein produced. And I think once that happens, then cheese, dairy identical cheese would not be too far of reach either. And that I think would make dairy ethical. And I think although there's a caveat to that, I think like if we scale it large enough to match the scale of dairy from animal agriculture, I think it'll have its own ethical issues, but the negativity of those ethical issues would still be drastically much less compared to animal agriculture.
Very interesting. Thank you for talking about that. Sage, go ahead.
So I feel like it's a pretty tricky question because there's the ethical portion and then there's the environmental impact. And I focus more on environmental impact and how that impacts us as humans. So it really depends on the size of the farm and the treatment of the animals. So if it's a smaller farm, with grass-fed cows, they have room to roam and all that. I feel like, sure, dairy would be perfectly fine within our lives, but humans are also consuming far more meat than they're supposed to be. Just going based off of all that I've experienced in my classes, people are only supposed to eat red meat maybe 2 to 3 times a week, when now people are consuming meat pretty much every day. So in that case, we're producing much more meat than how we have been in the past. So I feel like if people were to be consuming less meat and if there were less cows involved in the situation, then it would be more ethical. If we were to consume less meat over time, it would be more ethical.
For sure. Thanks for sharing. David, go ahead.
So for me, part of the answer depends on, not to be stereotypically lawyery, but what we mean by ethics. One way to look at it is like that ethics is a binary choice. It's either ethical or it's not ethical. But you can also look at ethics as a continuum, and your choice can be more ethical or less ethical. And for me, that latter way is the better way to handle this because, for example, if we're talking about certain cases where it's more or less ethical to consume animal-based dairy, there are places where I think it's more ethical to do that than others. I have worked on animal issues in communities. The one that pops into my head is some work I did in Kenya, where if people were to stop consuming animal-based dairy, there would be some significant nutritional challenges just given the infrastructure for getting people food and the food that was being produced in that community. Doesn't mean that it is absolutely okay to exploit animals for their milk. It just means that it's less ethically challenged than doing it gratuitously. And I think similarly, I would say, a farm that treats their cows better makes it less unethical, but it doesn't mean it's absolutely ethically legit. If those cows are going to end up just being killed at the end of their lives, they're going to be forcibly impregnated, have their children taken away, and so forth.
For sure. Cody, go ahead.
Yes, I was just going to sort of piggyback on that to sort of leverage one of like my meta critiques of the vegan and animal advocacy movement, which is, we talk about if it's ethical to consume something or if it's an industry is exploitative. I'd like to believe that most people can kind of agree, at least when you look at the worst factory farms, this is unethical, this is exploitative. What I think the piece we ignore is like a lot of things in our society are unethical and exploitative. These devices we're using were built under horrible labor conditions and at horrible cost to the environment. Every time we fly to visit a friend, it's arguably unethical. So I think like articulating why this particular industry, deserves a separate type of response where the onus is put on consumers to make sort of moral decisions in the supermarkets. There's really, really good reasons for that, but it's peculiar that we do this for only a couple of areas, and particularly in the vegetarian movement and not in other areas. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that there are gradations of ethics, and that ultimately, whether we think of that as like a consumer question or a law and public policy question, or there's some other sort of forum to hash that out. I think that's another like really important ingredient.
For sure. Thanks for bringing up that perspective. Mia, go ahead.
Yeah, so to me, it's really hard to answer this question, because exactly what Cody was saying of like, where do you see ethics lie? So I think rather, I'm kind of reframing the question for myself, rather than is it ethical for people to consume dairy? Is it ethical for the dairy industry to mass promote and advertise themselves? And, like doctors not to, prevent health issues, but to then solve them after, or try to solve them after they happen? Like, is that ethical? And I would say no. I think of the dairy industry being this like great iconic part of my life, whether that be good or bad. Got Milk. We've all seen the Got Milk ads. We've all seen, when I think of milk, I think of like the Horizon milk, like the red bottle with the cow jumping over, and milk being like super, super idolized in that way. And, the general information of why dairy is bad, and, the health effects, the animal reasons, the people reasons, basically all of it is not talked about. And I feel like if that were to be common and general knowledge, I think the question of ethics is really based on, consumer people choices, but because it's not, it's really hard for me to answer, like, is it ethical for people to consume dairy without them knowing the harms that go into the dairy industry and the money that's spent for those harms to be hidden.
Definitely, Mia. And that also brings up the question of why individuals are often blamed for the choices of huge corporations, and also just in general, what role consumers play in perpetuating that industry and the harms it causes. So thanks for bringing that up. Alexandra, go ahead. I believe you're muted.
I'm 58, almost 59, so I don't know where I had to find the hand raise thing and the mute. Jean's is raising his hand too, yeah. She said raise hand, and I was like, oh. I think speciesism is a real issue, and it's the overarching issue is that we accept gradations of good and bad much more better and worse, much more readily than we do if it was for a human. And I've heard this analogy, and excuse me if it offends some folks, but a man who takes a woman out to a really nice dinner and then rapes her she's raped. If he takes her out to a bad dinner and doesn't treat her that well and rapes her, she's still raped. And so with animals, we would label that person a rapist. Now, I agree with Mia and Cody and saying that people are taken advantage of here. Consumers are hoodwinked. We kind of want to be hoodwinked, though, because of our speciesism. And so I think we have to take some responsibility, too. But it's speciesism is really hard to kick. I mean, I have it in myself, I prefer my cat over the wasps and things like that, I don't really care about termites, and they have been killed in my house, gassed or whatever they do. So I have speciesism myself.
Yep, definitely, for sure. Amelie, go ahead.
Yeah, about the scale rather than the like two-way, ethical or unethical. I do think that in this world, everything is unethical in some way. So no matter what we do, it will have unintended consequences. But I think that the key there is unintended. With buying anything, there are probably going to be some unethical things that buying that item will cause, but we don't really know, right? Like we don't, it like buying paper, like do our trees cut down, like, oh yeah, we do know that, but do we know how they were cut down, where? No. Sustainably, unsustainably, we don't know. And there are some things that we just need to function in a modern society. But for most of the people watching this, most likely needing dairy isn't really a thing. Dairy is not an absolute necessity. And with things from animals, we know that their body was used. And that in itself, I think, is unethical. And then, yeah, it's also about speciesism. If we were to replace cows with dogs, like, would that be okay? And why do we look down on, like, using dogs' bodies, but not cows?
Completely, really great points. Ishan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess with the question, is it ethical for people to consume dairy? I guess there's two ways of looking at ethical. Like, do the means justify the end? And to that end, like, do we have like overarching ethical laws that no matter what, it's wrong to take the milk of another species, and that no action beyond that should happen? Or could we look at it the other way, that the benefit offered to other people, like in a utilitarian context, outweighs, and it's good for everybody, such that the bad that happens to the animal is minimized compared to the good that happens to everybody. And I think that when it comes to understanding the impact of good and bad in that, I think that there is some sort of speciesism that everybody has regarding just how much the impact of harm to an animal matters. And I think it's important for everybody to kind of give, I guess, more animals more respect and care. And I think that will kind of alleviate some level of speciesism. I think that it's a very tough question to answer, because say in like low-income countries where there are people who depend on milk to survive, I mean, there's clear positive impact that's happening to the person, but does that outweigh taking another animal's milk? And it's tough to answer. But I think in a first world country like the United States, I think it's clear that the current dairy practices are not ethical. However, I think I agree with like the modern practices and technological developments that like AJ brought up regarding like using like whey, just creating whey without any sort of animal harm. And I think if that's possible through technology and innovation, I think that would be ethical.
Definitely, for sure. Amelie, go ahead.
Sorry, I meant to lower my hand.
No worries. Does anyone else have anything to add on this question? Okay, great. I think we had some really awesome discussion on that question, and just overall how ethicality differs depending on the situation. So for the last question, this is more looking towards solutions and potential frameworks for moving forward. So this question is, what course of action can be taken to reduce the impact of dairy farming on animals? And there are a couple of different ways to look at this question. You can look at it on more of a micro level, like what choices consumers and individuals can make, or also a macro level, what changes can corporations and the government make. So you could answer that however you see fit. Go ahead, Alexandra.
I think government subsidies are huge, and the dairy industry is so subsidized. Jean, you could tell me if this is true, but I don't think it would survive without government subsidies. And especially with the fact that, and it's what keeps the prices lower, so that stops people from going to more plant milks. We have 15 different kinds of plant milks we can choose from, and just one cow's milk basically, and every so often a goat's milk. So really, plant milk is just offers so much to people that A, price, because it's dairy is subsidized, and B, of course, you mentioned the school program. Kids are raised on it, pretty much forced to have it, so you think it's good for you and that you have to have it, so you're raised with a health implication. And what I'm hoping is that the younger generation, either through the inventions that Perfect Day and others are doing, will push out dairy milk. That climate change ethics will push out animal ag, and that people in general understanding that it's bad for their health will push out dairy milk. And the work of people like Jean and Cody and AJ and Paula, and showing people what's going on, because the only reason people know what's going on about animal agriculture is because of the activists. It's not because the government or the dairy. So I think, that's my encapsulation in terms of the government.
Completely, definitely. Go ahead, Jean.
Yeah, there was a study that was done a few years back looking at dairy industry income, and they found that 73% of dairy industry income came from government programs. Now, whenever you're doing research or studies, there's usually biases, and this was at a time when there was battles between Canada and the US with import-export. So the Canadians wanted to show that the US overly subsidized dairy, but they still got that number, 73%, which is pretty significant. And, with a lot of this, to me, it all boils down to, systems of mutuality versus systems of extraction. People having agency and power to make informed choices. And this industry is very entrenched, and, we sort of grow up often without, milk is sort of like, has this cultural notion of, home and kindness and all the milk and cookies, all this. And so in some ways, the deception of this industry is among the most harmful. And another thing that the dairy industry does is, it's all about extraction, taking babies from mothers, taking milk from cows. When the cow is no longer productive, killing and eating her, right? So it's just this absolutely extractive model. And another area and it's extractive of the earth, destroying soil and resources, but they also extract identities of small farmers. Big dairies are pushing the small dairies out of business. They tell the stories about the suffering small dairies to get more government money that goes to the big dairies. So that's another form of extraction in this industry that I think just needs to be exposed. And so much of, I think, creating change is bringing more transparency, and then ultimately holding accountable those who have power and who are abusing their power, whether against other animals, against other people, and misleading in the process. So I think there's more awareness now than ever about the cruelty, about the fact that we can live well without drinking cow's milk, but the industry is pushing back, and all these alternatives are excellent as well, because in addition to people making conscientious choices not to support the cruelty of the dairy industry, just having the convenience of non-dairy alternatives makes a big difference. And we're seeing that. What the dairy industry is also doing, though, is that because they're not selling as much liquid milk, they're now putting it into cheese. It's like 10 pounds of milk turns into 1 pound of cheese. And this is another part of the whole extractive industry model where they just got to overproduce. So that's another thing happening now that is problematic. And of course, there's lots of government money that's now being invested in storing cheese, which is crazy. But these are the kinds of things that are, again, it's inefficient, it's harmful, and it needs to be exposed, and there needs to be more transparency.
100% transparency is so important. Go ahead, Mia.
Yeah, kind of touching on a part of what Jean was saying about, sorry if you hear the basketball in the background, the milk alternatives. There's a great organization named Greener by Default, who basically, you know how when you go into a restaurant or whatever, or you're served food on a cafeteria, if you don't go to school anymore, remember back in your cafeteria days, but basically they make vegan plant-based meals the default, and then that you can opt in for meat. And that really significantly reduces meat consumption because it's so much easier just to go with the flow than making an active choice. And they're doing that with dairy as well. So Bluebell, there's this like a coffee shop called Bluebell. They adopted a plant-based milk default option. So instead of opting for, oat milk, I think the milk is, I was trying to read up on it before I started talking. Oat milk is the default, and then you can opt in for dairy milk. And that's a great way to, gain more visibility, more normalcy of plant-based options, so that it's not, you don't have to choose, the buyer, the consumer does not have to choose between one or the other. And more likely in these instances, you're more likely just to get what you're provided, or buy what you're provided, with no option. So I think that's a great way to start talking about dairy. I think and making non-dairy milk more accessible and more available and more mainstream in terms of a widespread thing. I think, buying milk is a buying non-dairy milk is a super, I think in my world, it's a very normal thing to buy non-dairy milk, but still in these institutions that we see, like coffee shops and restaurants and stuff like that, I feel like making non-dairy milk the default, like Greener by Default is doing, is a great way to start that shift.
Definitely. I love Greener by Default and their work. It's so effective. Go ahead, David.
I'm going to build off of what Mia highlighted in terms of Greener by Default. That sort of paradigm shifting, I think, is really important. Not just because it changes, not just because you'll get people who just go with the flow and don't bother to change their order, but it changes the normative assumption of what you should be doing. And that not only makes it easier for people to accept that accept that, for example, an inability to digest lactose is not unusual. Most people in the world can't digest lactose. It's the ability to tolerate lactose that is weird. So it shouldn't be a matter of people, such as myself, being lactose intolerant. It's that some people have genes that make them lactose tolerant, but we should assume that most people can't eat it and stop trying to give school children dairy milk. As you said, Mia, people who have eaten at institutions, I made it all the way through K through my senior year of high school without ever having a school meal, because there was no way for me to get a school meal that didn't include dairy and meat, and neither of those were things I was going to be able to eat. So I think changing that sort of idea, that sort of phrasing is important, and I would extend that to normalizing calling oat milk milk, normalize calling, perfect day microflora milk or ice cream milk or ice cream. Make the animal-based people say that they are animal-based as well. I'd love to see people send subsidies. I suck at all of that, and I would include research subsidies. In the spirit of generational sharing, I will say, as a member of Gen X, I remember when stuffed crust pizza didn't exist. That wasn't a thing. The reason it exists is because the dairy industry, with the financial assistance of the federal government, invented stuffed crust pizza, advertised it, and popularized it, because it's a great way to sell more cheese to people. And as Jean was saying, cheese is really concentrated milk. It's entirely a marketing scheme. Beyond that, I'd really like to see more regulation and effective regulation of the industry. I think that if we're going to have animal-based dairy, there should be retirement plans for those calves. There should be plans limiting how often they get pregnant and have to give birth. They should be able to live with their babies and experience an environment that meets their species specific needs, and there should be regular administrative searches of that, and transparent labeling so that consumers know what they're getting. And finally, animal protection law, including all of the things I just mentioned, should be enforced against corporations and individuals involved, and the outcomes we should shift towards the animal's needs. Right now, if you get caught doing something bad to a dairy cow, whether you're a corporation or a person, you're probably looking at a fine. Fines don't do anything for the animals. I'd like to see corporations who get caught have to pay to send their animals to a sanctuary, or have to put money towards something that meets the needs of future animals if their current animal victims are dead.
Definitely. Thank you, David, for sharing all of that. So important. Cody, go ahead.
So, I guess generally speaking, my theory of social change is that it happens from the bottom up, that, it starts with visioning. In this case, articulating a new ethic about our relationship with animals that then trickles up into changes in our behavior and our policy and so forth. So, I think there's a lot of good reasons to have an unapologetic, pro-vegan message across the board for a lot of these issues. I think sort of my hot take here for how we might consider effectively, helping the most animals and advocacy here. I think there's a lot of good reasons I just want to acknowledge for why I think some vegetarian advocates might also consider making non-dairy advocacy much lower priority on some of the work that we do. I know someone mentioned before that a lot of people, would not give up cheese when they're ready to give up a lot of other products. The thing that really struck me the most when I was working in a dairy farm was just how much food a dairy cow produces compared to most other animals. So when you talk about it, getting a serving of eggs, you're financing several days of a chicken's suffering. If you're eating chicken meat, you're financing several weeks of it. There are horrible things that we do that allow a dairy cow to produce up to 80 or 90 pounds of milk per day. But then there's also this flip side where if you're looking at it from a sort of utilitarian or consequentialist point of view, each time that you get, a serving of cheese, or much less, some milk in your coffee or a micro ingredient, it's a relatively small impact in terms of how it flows into financing animal exploitation. I don't know. I think about that a lot because I know a lot of people who are so close to making lifestyle changes, and that's always been a big thing stopping them. So, as a matter of just harm management, I think I would encourage a lot of people to, if you can't get away from ice cream and pizza, give up the pork and chicken, and take it from there. I think, just meeting people where they're at is always still really valuable.
Interesting, for sure. Ishan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to taking action, I think something we all talked about was micro changes and also macro changes, and I think that they both kind of influence each other, in the sense that of course reduced individual consumption of animal products will eventually lead to reduced suffering caused by big meat, and vice versa. If we have fields such as government or trying to pass laws that try to control these industries, or science with the development of mock meat or impossible meat to change micro decisions. But I see a lot of interweavedness in macro systems and also personal choice. And I think that both systems are important, that it's important at the top and it's also important at the bottom. And I guess one thing that I was researching is that, one law that I feel like maybe in the US that this is rather specific, that we can do is we can ban tail docking. And essentially tail docking is cutting off portions of a cow's tail, which of course would cause suffering. But the point of it is to make the milking process easier for farmers. And I think that would be an approachable law to pass, because some countries have already banned tail docking. So there would be some sort of ethos already kind of momentum that could carry that law. But I think just in general, influence from both macro systems and microsystems, meaning that people who are involved in in animal rights themselves can do something about it, and people who even aren't can do something about it.
For sure. Alexandra, go ahead. I think you're on mute.
I used to hand out pamphlets for an organization at college campuses, and a lot of people would say what Paula said, which is, I can't give up cheese. That's what she hears a lot. And I would say, well, don't give up cheese. Just give up everything else that you don't really care about, because there's nothing more disrespectful than leaving something on your plate, or because you kind of don't really like it when that animal gave its life for you and you're not even appreciating it. You only sort of like it. So I've realized, even though I tend to be a very black and white person, and I learned a lesson about that when the LA City Council was voting on whether to allow elephants to be in circuses in LA. And I went down there and I was on the side of ban the elephants from the circus. That was it. And then there was another side of people who said ban the bull hook. And I was like, ban the bull hook? No, you got to ban the whole thing. Well, guess what? Ban the bull hook passed, and I was pissed off. But now circuses cannot survive without the bull hook. And that's why what David was talking about was, if you make certain rules, then eventually the company won't be able to survive. So I learned not to be so, extreme. I consider veganism not extreme, but extreme in the extreme, black and white. Because sometimes, like Ishan says, there's so many different ways to do it. So, yeah.
For sure. Does anyone have any additional thoughts on this topic? Mia, go ahead.
I mean, it's not really a full form thought, but I think it's really, really, this is not, I'm just responding to what you, Alexandra, said. It's really, really hard to be black and white in a vegan movement, just because we rely on so many things in day-to-day life, and we all have contradictions and stuff like that. So to be that black and white, it's hard. It's hard, especially when it comes to things like this, where it's one of Casey's questions was is it more ethical to have smaller dairy farms or stuff like that? It's really hard to be black and white on those types of things. Yeah, that wasn't a really full form comment, but I just want to highlight what you said about that. Yeah.
Definitely. Ethicality is just a huge spectrum, and there's so many different situations and so many different connections between everything that we do in our lives that it's impossible to be 100% morally correct. Jean, go ahead.
I just want to kind of, highlight what Mia just said there about how, these issues are complex, and there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of trade-offs. And, sometimes in the animal movement, kind of like, Alexandra was talking about, there's been this ban it all, right? And yes, we want to ban it all, but it's going to be hard to ban it all right now. So I've kind of always identified as an abolitionist, but I also identify as an incremental abolitionist. And when you start talking about this, instead of saying we're for a humane circus or for a humane whatever, we're against the worst cruelty, right? So we try to really message things so that we're not advocating for something that is less bad, but actually identifying that we're banning a certain bad thing. And as has been said, as you start doing this, you start making it harder for the industry to profit. And then you start also now creating different economic incentives. And one of the big areas where we do not have transparency is in, government supports and all the various costs associated with animal agriculture. And this is in the form of preferential access to water, and which they get at below market value, tax breaks on using land. There's actually developers who, while they're working through their permits, they put cows on the land and they don't pay taxes because it's technically a farm. So there's these these mechanisms that are used to enable animal agriculture. And so, starting to work against those and just by doing so, driving up the price, and then having more transparency and more visibility on full cost accounting of the system, including the healthcare costs that come when we eat this food and it makes us sick, including workers who are, injured and suffer in the system, communities who suffer next to factory farms who literally have waste spewed onto their houses in some cases. So, but the dairy industry is really kind of one of the most entrenched and gets some of the most subsidies. So financially, they take a lot of public resources, and culturally, they have this sort of, status that I think also needs to be challenged. So it's complex, and it's really good that, to think about it as it's not black and white, it's very nuanced. And I think, being very careful in our approach to stop bad stuff, well, keeping the dream of what's the ideal. And I agree with, what Cody was saying earlier about change from bottom up. That's kind of where my gut is. But there's also a lot that happens policy-wise. So I think we need both, the ground game and the air game. So I think both of those are important.
For sure. They're definitely so important in making change. Mia, go ahead.
Not to keep on talking, but I think one thing I would say, Jean, is it's not to stop the bad things, it's to make the most good things happen. Yeah, but I agree with you. That's just a small comment.
For sure. David, go ahead.
I know we've talked a lot about the animal dairy industry and animal scenarios in the United States. I do think a lot of what we've talked about is applicable in other scenarios. I'd specifically like to highlight, when we're talking about subsidies, the government is fairly involved in subsidizing the export of the industrial farming model to other countries. The idea being that American corporations can then go plunk their dairy down in some other country and start making a lot of money. So I think when we're talking about knowing where the money's going and what's being subsidized, that's part of it too. The government could be subsidizing non-animal-based dairy stuff. And then in terms of transparency and labeling, I think it's also really important that we know what domestic products are being shipped where and what products are being imported. There's something pretty pernicious about the prospect of mistreated animals being raised and their products being raised in the United States, the environmental impact of that falling on impoverished communities around those animals, and then the product being sold elsewhere at an exorbitant price that doesn't go back to any of the harmed parties, whether that's sold domestically or internationally. And I know there are places where that conversation about import and export becomes pretty significant. I don't know for dairy, but I know, for example, Sophia, I know in Australia, there's a lot of conversation about export of animals for slaughter. I don't know if it is the same for dairy.
For sure. Awesome. Does anyone else have any final thoughts that they'd like to share? Paula, go ahead.
Thank you. I think something else could be challenging ag laws. So that way we could basically just have like the freedom of speech and get into these places and still show to people what's going on, and in that way show and hold these companies accountable. Sometimes we can't hold them accountable because we cannot show what's happening. And they have these like marketing and all what we all see is just like these happy cows, and it's not real. And sometimes they just even say, oh, that's old footage, that's old stuff, we have changed. Have you? Did you really change? And we're not able because the law is with them. So I think that's another point. Challenge them. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know how to do that, but I think that would be an amazing also thing to do.
Definitely. All right. Any last thoughts before we wrap up? Okay, amazing. Thank you all so much for participating. This roundtable was honestly phenomenal, and I'm so grateful that all of you chose to participate because the thoughts that you all shared and the perspectives that you all had made for a really, really meaningful discussion, and I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. To everyone watching, thank you so much for watching and tuning in. It's so important that we have safe spaces to hear each other out and share opinions, especially to form bridges between generations, because it's not always that easy for Gen Z and the older generations to talk together and form solutions together. So thank you so much for helping us make this whole roundtable possible. For all of our participants, we'll send out a post evaluation after the roundtable, which should be out tomorrow. So please make sure to fill that out as soon as you're able to. And again, for anyone watching who wants to get involved, apply to Zoomers to Boomers. The link is in the chat in our link tree, and we still have plenty of space. Tune into next month's roundtable, which will be on July 26th at the same time, and that's going to focus on the way that dairy impacts humans, which is also going to be an amazing discussion because it's a super multifaceted issue. Thank you so much again, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Thank you,
Bye.
Gail. Thanks for facilitating.
Thank you for being here.